Good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's screening of Adrift as part of Curious About, our digital science festival brought to you by Glasgow Science Centre. My name is Nina, I'm the planetarium coordinator here at Glasgow Science Centre, and I will be looking after the live Q&A portion after the film this evening. We are going to start with the film. It's a short film, it's only about 8 minutes long, and after that I'll be introducing our two guest speakers, Adam Sébire and Dirk Notz. Without further ado though, we'd like to start the film, so sit back, relax, and we'll see you back here afterwards. I do hope you all enjoyed the film Adrift. I've watched it a few times now in preparation for this event, and each time something new and different has kind of captured my attention, so I'm very much looking forward to tonight's event. If you're like me and have some questions for our speakers, please do pop them into our YouTube comments box, and we'll do our best to get through all of them this evening. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our very first speaker this evening. He's our filmmaker, Adam Sébire, so we'll bring him up now. Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're delighted that you could join us all the way from, you're currently in the...
I'm marooned in the Arctic still. I'm not at home in Australia, no.
No, not yet. If you'd like to introduce yourself, we'd love to hear a bit more about sort of who you are and what you do.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I studied documentary filmmaking at the National Film School of Australia afters, and then went on to make a lot of documentaries for Australian television. And it was while I was filming one of those in this Pacific island of Tuvalu, which is all of 2 meters above the rising waters of the Pacific, that I started to become interested in climate change, and my focus really turned towards that. And fast forward to my present situation, I was in Svalbard doing some research when the pandemic began, and I got stuck on the wrong side of Australia's very thorough closed borders. And I'm now, well, I got stuck in a lighthouse for 3 months, but I'm now in far north Arctic Norway again. And I guess I'm one of the Arctic Circle's 3 million human inhabitants. So I'm now kind of working on my PhD research with a kind of a front row view of climate change, if you like.
Which I'm sure is going to impact that PhD research in quite a big way.
Yes, that's right.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam. I'd also like to bring in our other speaker for tonight, Dr. Dirk Notz, who's joining us from Hamburg, I believe.
Yes, that is correct. Hello, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a bit more about what you do.
Yes, sure. Well, I traveled to the Arctic as a student and spent 1 year in Svalbard in the high Arctic. And I just immediately fell in love with that landscape. And as a researcher, I fell in love with it, but I also felt I want to understand it. And so I basically became a climate researcher with a focus on the polar regions of our planet. Trying to understand their beautiful disappearing landscapes. And so that's what I've been doing for a living ever since, basically. I'm also one of the lead authors of the most recent IPCC report, where I was part of the chapter focusing on ice, the ocean, and sea level. And in addition to loving to do research, I also love to share my research with as many people as possible, which is why I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight. Thank you.
And it's why we're so glad that you're here joining us as well. So I suppose it's high time we get stuck into a few of the questions. So my fantastic producer is going to bring those up. So first one is for Adam. So visually, Adrift is a really striking film. And I think it's fair to say that the landscape has quite a lot to do with that. What challenges did you face filming somewhere like Greenland?
Well, with Greenland, you know, you're talking about a massive country with only about 50,000 people, mostly Greenlandic Inuit living there. So, and ships can't get through the sea ice generally to the northern settlements till May each year. So I had to fly there. And actually that year, the sea ice had broken up, I think around about mid-April. So it's very unpredictable these days, which is one of the problems that they're facing up there. It's very hard to run your dog sled over ice when you're not sure how thick it is, and it's changing each year. So there were very many unhappy dogs keeping me awake all hours of the night near my little hut. And when I wanted to go further north to find some sea ice that hadn't broken up, I had to sail with this Inuit narwhal hunter. He hunted these narwhals, which are these animals, these mammals with the single horn on their forehead. And as an Australian, I knew nothing about being on sea ice. I had barely even seen the stuff. So he, even though we didn't speak a common language, he showed me with his auger, this great big long stick he has, how to prod the ice in front of me so I didn't fall through a weak spot in it, which was really important. He lent me a survival suit, which would give me, I think, 2 or 3 minutes to live if I fell through. And then I had this crazy idea. I just found a saw about a few hours before getting on the boat. So I thought, actually, as well as marking out the ice, I'll saw through it. And yeah, well, it wasn't so easy. It was very cold. Fingers, batteries, none of these things were very happy about being there. Although I was, extremely excited to be there, and I think the adrenaline sort of powered me through something that was, in retrospect, quite a silly idea. And even the drone decided to have problems with magnetic north being so close. It couldn't find north and started to go a bit haywire. So I might look like I'm doing nothing sitting on the ice floe there, but actually I'm really trying to keep the drone from flying off into the distance, whilst also trying not to fall through the sea ice itself on this very wonky chair.
I didn't realize the survival suits gave you such a small kind of margin for error there. Gosh, that's one way to add some adrenaline to the process.
This wasn't a particularly good survival suit, but it was enough. And he had to disappear, of course. He went off fishing, I think, because he wasn't going to be in the shot. And I think he said he was coming back for me, but it was very hard to understand.
Gosh, that's definitely going to make it a memorable experience, if nothing else. And Dirk, you said you've been up to the Arctic as well, as part of your research. What challenges are there as a scientist working up there?
Well, I think the Arctic. So I've basically been up there every year since being a student, and the Arctic is, as beautiful as it is, it's really unforgiving. Any mistake can you really be really dangerous, which on the other hand also means that you just prepare incredibly well, and with experience you're also able to overcome some of the major problems you might run into otherwise. But I think really the most challenging thing in the Arctic is that it is simply nature, and nature doesn't care whether you're there or whether you're not there. It's not mean or evil or anything. It just is. And the weather, for example, is changing incredibly rapidly. So sometimes when we do research in a glacier and we walk into a sort of glacier system and then come out a couple of hours later, the weather might have turned from beautiful sunshine to a crazy snowstorm. And you have to prepare for these very rapid changes and for also the possibility to get stuck somewhere. And so security and knowing that nature doesn't care about you, nature is unforgiving, but also simply incredibly beautiful, makes for me work up there both challenging, but also something that I long for every single moment that I'm not up there.
That's incredible. And I feel like a lot of people watching in Glasgow will appreciate the experience of having weather change on them very, very quickly. We're quite used to that here. I think we've got another wee question coming up. Here we go. So Dirk, for those of us who maybe aren't mathematically inclined, would you mind talking us through the equation that Adam uses in his film to calculate the kind of sea ice loss, and how you kind of came to formulate that in a little bit more detail?
Yes, I think it would possibly be easiest if I could share 4 slides maybe on in order to do that. Because I think it's really helpful to maybe broaden our perspective briefly and look at the Arctic as a whole. So what you see here is how the Arctic Ocean looked like in 1992 on the 21st of September, which is at the end of summer in the Arctic. And throughout summer, there's 24 hours of daylight, the sun is hitting the Arctic, and so this sea ice cover that you see covering the Arctic Ocean here is at its annual minimum, and then in September the sun goes down, gets cold again, and the sea ice cover expands again. And this is how the Arctic Ocean looked like at the time of the minimum annual sea ice coverage in 1992. And why I picked this year, 92, because that was when in Rio de Janeiro they had this big Earth Sustainability Conference and decided to, from now onwards, politicians and societies would finally look after our planet to ensure that we can hand it over to future generations as beautifully as we found it. But if you look into the Arctic, you realize that since 1992, things have changed quite drastically. So if we look into last year, how the Arctic looked like on the 21st of September, we'll see that about half of that sea ice cover has disappeared. And it's half the area that has disappeared, but these ice floes that are left here are only also about half as thick as they used to be. And so if we reduce the area by half and the thickness by half, we can very easily calculate that in terms of overall amount of volume in summer, we've lost about three quarters of Arctic sea ice. And when I say we've lost it, that's not quite correct, but we humans have melted it. 1/4 is left. And unfortunately, we're pretty certain that we are about to lose this final quarter over the next few decades, so that the Arctic Ocean, at least in summer, will become an ocean like any other on this planet, where you can just go to the North Pole with a ship and look at the water there. And so this landscape is about to disappear. And one part of our research, in addition to trying to just understand this landscape as long as it's there, is to understand this loss. How quickly does it happen? When will we have lost all the ice? And we've known since a long time through various other strands of research that it's really us humans causing this sea ice loss with the emission of greenhouse gases, in particular CO₂. And so a couple of years ago, we had this idea of maybe just looking at the measurements of how much sea ice there is in the Arctic and how much CO₂ humans have emitted up to a certain year, and to simply plot these two measurements against each other for every single year that we have good measurements for. And we did that, and this is how the graph looks like. So just to walk you through this, here in 1979, which is the first year for which we have good sea ice data from satellites, up to then, humans had emitted about 500 billion tons of CO₂ since 1850, and we had about 6 million square kilometers of sea ice in the Arctic. And then every year ever since, humans have emitted more and more and more and more CO₂, up to 2020, by which time we had emitted about 1,700 billion tons of CO₂, and we had a sea ice coverage of about 3 million square kilometers. And so what we find in these observations, and also in every single climate model simulations, that there is this relatively linear, striking relationship between how much sea ice we have in the Arctic and how much CO₂ humans have emitted. And basically all this equation that Adam wrote onto the ice describes is this linear line here, which we can also use to look into the future to figure out when the ice will be gone, how much CO₂ we can still emit until the ice is gone. And the nice thing in some sense about this line is that it has a very, very intuitive relationship, namely that for every ton of CO₂ emissions, we lose an ice flow the size of 3 square meters. And so this ice, as you've seen in Adam's video, is about 1 meter thick. And so whenever a person emits 1 ton of CO₂, you can imagine that an ice flow the size of 3 square meters is disappearing in the Arctic. And that really, to me, is the first relationship that we scientists have ever come up with that makes it possible to relate global climate change to our own individual actions. And that is what Adam is doing in this movie, where he calculated how much tons of CO₂ he was emitting by flying to Greenland, and to then cut out that piece of ice to visualize the impact of his single seat on this airplane on how much ice we have in the Arctic. And so it's basically this relationship that this equation is describing, which we can then also, to close this off, now use to look into the future and how the Arctic will look like. And so basically what this graph is showing here, this is on this line, this is where we sit today. From January to December, the Arctic is ice covered. The more CO₂ we emit, the more we move into this region where the Arctic becomes ice-free in summer, and all that we can derive from this relationship.
Thank you. That's made it incredibly clear. Just to kind of put things in context, what sort of activities would release that 1 ton of CO₂, if you know off the top of your head?
Yeah. For example, if you fly to the US from Europe, that would usually be 1.5 tons of CO₂. On average, for example, in Germany here, each person emits about 9 tons of CO2 per year. So each German, in some sense, would melt about 27 to 30 square meters of sea ice. I think in the UK it's less. It's about 5 to 6 tons per person. But also there you can sort of relate that to then 15 to 16 to 18 square meters of sea ice. Driving your car for something like 7,000, is that correct? 7,000 kilometers might be a ton of CO2. Let me get that straight. No, it's not. It's 20,000 kilometers. But yeah, sort of, it's something that is not outrageously lots of action, but it's something that you can relate to day-to-day activities.
Yeah, that's certainly really useful. And yeah, the linear graph is, you can't argue with that. It's incredibly clear. Thank you very much for that. I think we've got another question coming up. So I suppose maybe this leads on quite nicely from the conversation that we're having. Adam, in the description of the film, it's mentioned that climate change is quite abstract to a lot of people. Would you say this is changing as the very real effects of climate change are being more widely felt? And Dirk, do feel free to kind of jump in as well.
Yeah, well, for sure. I feel that the increasing instance of these once in a century heat waves, fires and floods really brought climate change home to Australians, my home country, just as I was coming to the Arctic, supposedly to find the canary in the coal mine, you know, this place that was warming 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the world. I thought, this is where at last I'll be able to visualize what the changes that are happening. But meanwhile, Australia was burning down. So these sort of changes give you a very direct emotional connection. But I still think it's quite hard for people to appreciate the link between an action and their emissions. For example, you know, switch on a light that then makes a coal-fired power plant a few kilometers away work a little bit harder, emitting a little bit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that then some years hence might have an effect somewhere else completely different. So this is a very abstract and not very emotionally engaging way of thinking about things. Sometimes people try to visualize it with tons of carbon dioxide in large black balloons. But again, I find that quite hard to relate to. Then there was this very new field of climate attribution science, which I'm very interested in, which allows scientists to say that, say, my flight made an extreme weather event perhaps a fraction of a percentage more likely. So they're looking at probabilistic kind of effects. But my brain in particular is not particularly good at evaluating future probabilities. And it was only when I saw Dirk's formula that I was really able to correlate, to appreciate with my senses the impact of how much damage my choices would make. I mean, if I'd flown business class to Greenland, I would have had to double the size of the amount of ice that I destroyed, because, you know, I'm only cutting out the ice for one seat on that return journey. And I mean, of course, it's impossible to know where my 5.23 tons of greenhouse gases really ended up having an impact. But yeah, certainly this correlation was a very concrete moment. And I had this kind of out-of-body experience as I was watching the drone on the monitor, sitting on the ice floe. I could sort of, yeah, I had a relationship to climate change, that this ice floe, which I was killing, was actually keeping me afloat, was preserving me, and I doomed it. So it was very, very strong for me at that moment.
And could you make a tangible connection before you left for the Arctic? Is that correct, when you planted some trees?
Well, no, you know, actually I planted on this journey, the journey that brought me here this time, I decided no longer was I going to tick the little box on the flight booking that said offset my flight, because that was just, it was too abstract, it was too easy. It didn't really connect me to the degree of damage that I was doing. So on this journey, I thought, okay, I'm going to work out in advance. It was 9.9 tons this time, because the company that flew me was flying me a premium economy. And that equated to, I needed to plant 149 Eucalyptus viminalis, which was on my parents' farm. quite degraded soil, and it really was hard work. And this was just for one seat, you know, and it really gave me a very visceral connection to the scale of damage that I was doing. But then the kicker is that I had to look, I still have to look after these trees for the next 100 years. And they're very vulnerable where my parents live to fires, extreme fires. They're in the middle of New South Wales.
And again, that kind of shows that this is a legacy that we're leaving for the future, the kind of changing climate. Dirk, is there anything you'd sort of want to add in at this point?
Yes, I think the point with climate change is that what we're doing is really, really hard sometimes to grasp intuitively, even though the magnitude of the changes that we bring about this planet is incredible. And so what I think, how I try to visualize and to also communicate about climate change is to do both, to try and give people this sense of the scale of changes that we bring about, which are massive. So one example, for example, is that if you look at the past history of climate change on our planet, you'll easily see that climate change has always been around. But for the past 10,000 years, for example, the climate on our planet has been incredibly stable. And our entire civilization development since the Stone Age up to this meeting we have tonight has basically happened at the backdrop of this very, very stable climate for the past 10,000 years. And now we're really leaving that comfort zone to which every bit of our civilization is adapted to. And we are moving the climate into territory that our civilization has never experienced. Indeed, the last decade was as warm as our planet has last been more than 100,000 years ago. And so with the rapidity over a couple of decades that is hard to imagine, we've really propelled our entire planet into a new climate stage, which our civilization now needs to adapt to. And that really is the challenge we're facing. And we see this impact of leaving this comfort zone of the climate that our civilization had adapted to in these extreme events that Adam was mentioning. And so trying to bridge between what we actually feel on the ground in these individual extreme events to the large scale changes that we bring about that we can really only visualize by data and graphs and stuff like that. That's one of the things I try to get across when I communicate about climate change.
And this is why we very much appreciate your both being here tonight. Thank you both. I think we've got another one coming in there. So, and I suppose this again could go to both of you. So despite climate change being a very real threat to us all, it's still quite a controversial subject to cover. What kind of response have you had to the film, given that climate change is the focus of it?
Well, the last screening that I was personally at, which was up in Svalbard, Gallery Svalbard, showed it. Somebody told me that they overheard a miner. It's a coal mining town. One of the miners came in and said, what a clown. And I thought, oh, well, that's not a compliment. But actually, artists like clowns, I think, have this kind of social license to push ideas to their logical or illogical extremes. And, a lot of other people were quite surprised and excited by the final image, which I guess it's quite metaphorical, kind of mythical. It keeps it open. It's not designed as a lecture, this film. And maybe that prizes open different parts of people's brains to think about the idea in a different way. I mean, there was even a German theatre director who contacted me recently to say that she'd made a play for children about the story of a polar bear who floats off on an ice floe, which I thought was, okay, this is great. People take what they will read their own things into a visual form of visual communication that's left a bit open.
Mm. Oh, I mean, as I said at the introduction, kind of watching the film, every time I've watched it, I've picked out something different that I've gone, I would quite like to know more about that. And yeah, it's kind of nice to know that it's having an impact that's kind of helping explain this to younger children, which I suppose, Dirk, is kind of crucial really for the future. If you want to add anything.
Because this question that climate change is a controversial subject still, I would like to just briefly reflect on that, because I think what often happens in communication about climate change is that two things are put into the same sort of bowl of controversy. Because for me, there is this inner core of climate science, how the climate system works, which is what I do for a living, basically, to try and understand that. And that is something where we have intense debates in science, how things work. And as a scientist, we do nothing else but trying to figure out that somebody else got it wrong all along, and to become famous for showing that what we've believed all the time was wrong. But when it comes to all the core concepts of climate change, for decades and decades, thousands of scientists all around this planet have tried to find any major gaps, and they haven't found any. And to us as scientists, that says this inner core of how the climate system works, that CO2 warms the climate, that this climate change brings our planet into a completely new state. All of these kind of things, they are scientifically not controversial. They are established because we have tried for decades to find any gaps. So that is this inner core. The thing that is controversial, and where I think we should have more discussions really, is what do we make out of this knowledge? How do we act as societies? What kind of, what does that mean for me as an individual? And I can easily understand that then is something where controversy is needed in order for us to figure out as society, how do we now deal with this knowledge? And so what I find really important when we talk about climate change is to take these two things as separate, because the inner core of natural sciences knowledge is established since decades, and we haven't found any gaps. But what to do with that clearly is controversial. And I just wanted to make this distinction very, very clearly here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, within the scientific community, as you say, it's not controversial. This is accepted fact. But it's kind of once you start discussing it out with the scientific community, for example, at an event like this, then yes, that's where the controversy comes in. Thank you so much for adding that in. I think we might have another one. So you sort of touched on it a little bit at the start, but what inspired you to focus on climate science as a career?
I think when I started off on that, it really was this notion that we can't really act on climate change because everything is still uncertain. That I think read basically in a newspaper article a couple of days before I had to subscribe to what I want to study. And I found that really a very, very interesting topic. And I said, I wasn't quite sure what to do. And so I just give it a try. And then, as I said, first, I got really fascinated by the complexity and the beauty of how this planet works and how incredibly hard it is to understand it. But then really going to the Arctic and seeing these landscapes really, really captured me and made me think that I want to understand this landscape. And over the past decade or so, with seeing the sea ice and the landscape in Svalbard, where I just spent a lot of my life, changing really, really rapidly, also made me aware that in some sense, for example, just now, we might be the last generation of researchers who can collect certain kinds of data on this planet. For example, how does sea ice work when it's in the Arctic all year round? When we can have an ice floe survive for a couple of years, what kind of ecosystem do we have on this ice floe compared to one that melts completely in summer with everything that's on it and then regrowth in winter? Once that landscape has disappeared, everything that is connected to it from an ecological point of view might have disappeared as well. And so we really are running out of time to understand this sort of stable state of our planet that we've had for almost 10,000 years. Because in the future, we will be in a different state with our planet. We will have probably no more sea ice in the Arctic, depending on when or in summer at least, depending on how warm we make the planet. We will have rising sea levels. We will have loss of forests. We will have a different ecology in the UK. No matter where we look, it will be a different planet. And so trying to sample as much as possible of the planet we have just now, I feel is something that I feel responsible to also with regard to the future generations that can no longer collect that kind of data. Yeah,
you can, hopefully the kind of change does happen, positive change rather than climate change, but you can understand very much why this work and the work that both of you are doing is so valuable for the future. I think we might have one more question coming in. So this is maybe sort of more positive way of looking at it. So this is for both of you. So there is a lot to be concerned about with the causes and very real effects of climate change. Is there anything that makes you feel especially hopeful for the future?
Well,
a big question.
I could go first. I think there may be two things really. The first thing is the younger generation with, for example, the Fridays for Future movement, where if I think about who really gives me hope, it's their understanding of what climate change means for them. I think they have often a much deeper, much more intuitive understanding of what that climate change would mean for us humans than many of people from the older generation. The second thing, however, is also something that I like about this equation, that because in some sense, this equation shows we are all part of the problem. We are all part of causing this climate change. By releasing a ton of CO2, we melt 3 square meters of sea ice in the Arctic. But what I like about knowing that I'm part of the problem, it gives me the agency to know that I can also be part of the solution. I also have the power to turn things the other way around. And that's what I would also try to communicate, that we can make this mental shift from being part of the problem to becoming part of a solution by not emitting, for example, a ton of CO2. I do not melt 3 square meters of sea ice, I preserve them. And so with every single action, I can become part of the solution of sustaining this planet in its beauty as much as still possible for future generations. And this agency is something that every single person has.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very easy to feel helpless in the face of quite a lot of quite alarming headlines, but it's not about everybody getting everything perfect and doing everything perfectly. It's about just making small changes that, as you say, do have a tangible impact. Adam, I don't know if you've got anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I started to feel hopeful when the leaders at COP21 agreed to aspire to this 1.5 degree target. That was a really important step, and I'm really hoping that there's concrete measures come out of COP26. But as Dirk says, there are social movements that are determined to show their support for these sort of ideas. Fridays for the Future is absolutely one I too would have total admiration for. The climate strikes. There will be a global day of action on Saturday, November the 6th. So I hope, and this is important, especially for people who are too young to vote, as I imagine a lot of our viewers are tonight. If you can't vote, then you can also show your voice through that way. But also, I'd say I think the pandemic response a little bit gave me a little bit more hope as well, because in this time we sort of have learnt to slow down, even though often it was against our will. To focus on our local environment and also to act on the scientific consensus. And I think these 3 things, if anything good can come out of the pandemic and be translated into the battle against climate change, then I hope it's those 3 things.
I think there is still a lot to be kind of hopeful about. And thank you both for sort of emphasising that. I don't know if we've got any more questions to come in. We've got one last brief question that's come in. So what do you hope COP26 can achieve?
I think one of the things that made me realize what climate change actually means came from a survey I read the other day, where 18-year-old young people in Germany were asked, is this planet still a place where humans can live in 100 years' time? And I was really shocked to see that about 40% of them said, no, I don't think so. Gosh. And I think this feeling of this planet will no longer be inhabitable in 100 years' time comes from the combination of the science we tell the world how things work, and the feeling that politicians or we humans are not able to solve this problem. And this combination, I think, gives rise to this feeling of a bit of hopelessness. And what I really hope that COP26 can achieve is to prove that feeling wrong by sending out this message that, well, the science is what it is, but you're wrong in thinking that we humans cannot change that we cannot solve that. But that COP26 really sends out the message that we humans have understood and that we are able to change, and that we will change this problem and we will stop it.
Yeah, Adam's nodding vigorously there.
Dirk has put it beautifully.
No, absolutely. We're hopeful as well, and it is absolutely crucial to just for people to feel like they can take action, they can have an impact and a positive impact when it comes to climate change. I think that's just about us running out of time. So I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you for joining us. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us for Adrift as part of Curious About Our Planet, which is Glasgow Science Centre's Digital Science Festival. We do have a quick survey for you, which is just going into the description at the bottom there. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how we can improve and do better in these festivals. But from me and from Adam and from Dirk, I do want to say a huge thank you to both of you for joining us, to everyone who was watching. Of course, if you are still curious about our planet, there are still plenty of events and you can watch back these interviews. There's a whole raft of them on our website. But from me and from Adam and from Dirk, just to say good night and thank you all for joining us.